Good afternoon. Well, today I'm going to talk to you about what happened in the Tudor period from the perspective from London. I'm going to go over quite a lot of the ground that's before, but in a slightly different perspective. I always wondered what it might be like to be in a medieval hospital. And it depends on which hospital you're in, but some of them would, for example, be similar to this room. And we know this because some of these medieval hospitals still exist. And there would have been catering, and there would have been dormitories, and this room would have been used for the social functions and feeding of the elderly group who were present. And many fraternities, even in London, would have looked very similar to the building you're now standing in. Other medieval hospitals would have had naves with beds on either side of them, with dormitories, again, single sex. We have to understand that the medieval concept was very different to ours. The living and the dead occupied the same space. And you were just in transition on your way, eventually, to heaven. So prayers for the dead and your ancestors, rather in other cultures, were extremely important. Now, it has been described that NHS hospitals are medieval. I think this is an absolute disgrace. They're nowhere near as good as medieval hospitals. Victorian, perhaps, but certainly not medieval. Professor Rawcliffe has gone over many examples of what was a medieval hospital, and some of these still exist doing their original function. And here are the inmates of a medieval hospital in Winchester, just having gone to their daily prayers. Very typical thing you'd have to do is to go and pray every day to the person who founded your hospital. Whittington's hospital we mentioned before. One of the functions of the 12 inmates was to every day go and pray for the soul of Whittington. These are praying for Stephen of Blois. They wear their uniforms. This was another thing that was very common in medieval hospitals. And this uniform here with a hat and their lovely clean cloaks would have been provided, for example, at the Savoy or the Domus Conversii. We have examples of what their uniforms would be like. The interior of the chapel is amazing. This is built for just 12 people to say prayers to the founder. An astonishing setup. So they also were to provide dole to passing wayfarers. Dole is still given in this hospital. You have to ask for it, though. You knock on the door and they will provide you with a small bowl of bread and some beer. Care of the elderly and infirm. But it's very difficult for us to then transfer what this looks like into thinking of what a modern hospital looks like. And this is where the confusion occurs in what exactly a medieval hospital was. There were lots of them. Professor Rawcliffe mentioned there were at least 1,100, and 35 of these in England and Wales were in London, and include many leprosoriums. But it also depends on what you call a hospital, what that number comes up to. Some hospitals, for example, were founded for one inmate, and when the inmate died, the hospital passed out of the record. There must have been many hospitals for which there are no records. There's certainly hospitals which are only mentioned transitory in the documents, and they're never mentioned again, so we know they existed. We know, for example, there was a stone house for mad people in Charing Cross. We know very little else about that hospital. And they are very impressive buildings. Now, the building on the right is the Hospital of St John in Reading, and you could stay here for 2 nights only, and then you were thrown out. So we've mentioned this was not for the... There was 2 classifications of the poor and travelling, rather like we have today. There was the deserving poor, and there was the undeserving poor. Doesn't sound too different to how we consider things nowadays. And there were problems in differentiating which was which, or whom was whom, even in the medieval period. Amazingly, this building housed 400 people at a night, and fed and watered them before they went on their way. This function of caring for travellers had existed in Saxon times, and many of the large priories, and remember the buildings in Saxon times were much more impressive than what we've been left with. The first act of destruction the Normans did was to destroy every large building in England and rebuild it in the Norman style. We know that some of these are impressive buildings because we have the ground floor plan of them. For example, Winchester Cathedral, Salisbury, up on the hill, not where the new site is, of course. There were statutes that say that St John's, Cambridge, sick and weak people should be admitted kindly and mercifully. Well, that would be a very good introduction for my hospital to have. When you come to accident emergency, you must be admitted kindly and mercifully. not actually have someone there on a computer going, sick, yes, drugs, allergies. You know, we really are losing something with modern medicine, and we really must think of the roots of where we came from. We came from a tradition of caring, and we need to go back to those roots, and we need to look at what these medieval institutions were about. They cared for elderly people kindly. They cared for sick people until they died. And they cared also for specific people, such as blind and lepers, and we'll come on to that, and insane, which they didn't do quite as well. Now, if you couldn't be in a certain hospital a leper, a pregnant woman, I didn't know the sort of pregnant people there are than pregnant women, but it seems to have crept into English language. Wounded and cripples, there were other hospitals that looked after. There were specific hospitals for lepers, pregnant, cripples and insane people. And also what's confusing is sometimes what's called a hospital we don't know. Sometimes they're referred to as colleges or even chapels. And as Carol Rawcliffe said, some of them looked very, very much like religious buildings. They looked very much like monasteries. And it's very difficult, even from the archaeological record, unless we've got a written record, to determine whether this was a fraternity, a hospital, or a monastery, or all three. And some of these buildings could do all three functions. This building down here is a resting place or hospital on the way to Dover. And this is where travellers on the way to go to France would stay 1 or 2 nights. Some hospitals were actually part of the mainstream religious movement. So St Mary's within Cripplegate, St Mary's without Bishopsgate, already mentioned, and Maiden Bradley, actually attended chapter meetings on the Augustines. So they were regarded by the main movement as being monasteries. Some of the buildings here, which is a hospital for priests in Canterbury, still exist pretty much intact, as you can see on the right-hand side. And the interior of one of their 3 large halls looks very similar to this building that you're sitting in now. If you happen to be in France, you could have in Beaune a rather wonderful building with enamelled roofs, beautifully built. There was one building in London with enamelled roofs, and that was St John's, and we'll come to that at a moment. At the moment, it's the hardcore rubble for Somerset House, and if we have time, I'll tell you why. Stowe describes that there are in and about the City of London certain houses called colleges, not so much designed for learning, but for the comfortable and common living together of such who are aged, poor, decayed by sickness or misfortunes, and are mere foundations of charity. And that's about as good a definition of a medieval hospital as you're going to find anywhere. What's amazing is that the first hospitals founded in England still exist in pretty much working order. The top one here, founded by Lanfranc, who's Bishop of Caen, he rebuilt the Saxon Cathedral, which we alluded to before, knocking down this wonderful large building and building an even more beautiful building in its place. He also constructed a house of stone. Now look at this building here, typical early Romanesque, English Romanesque style, often using stone for the main parts of the architecture from Caen itself, and then using local rubble for the poorer building areas. He then founded another one outside the hospital gates for lepers. Now, you always put leprosy hospitals outside town. In fact, you put all hospitals for revolting diseases outside the town, apart from Thomas Acon, which is a separate example that occurs later. And then the third hospital was built by his colleague Gundulph at Rochester, just down the road, and this is St Bartholomew's Hospital, and this is the Gilbert Scott restored chapel of that original medieval hospital. So the first 3 hospitals, here we have significant remains of them still existing. And funnily enough, in London you can see significant remains, even in this town, which has been bombed, burnt, built on many times. There are still significant remains for us to reconstruct an idea of what they might have been like. The first function of the hospital was worship, and I'm not going to go too much into this because I think Carol Rawcliffe really did explain this very well. But this picture at the top, which was drawn by my neighbour, who's an architectural historian, sort of reconstruction, of what the interior of Bart's Hospital might have looked like. And we can see the priests giving bread and looking after the inmates who were in aisles on either side. It was probably a dual aisle building, with at the top end a priest at the altar. It's very important for the patients to be able to see the altar, because it's important for them to participate, because they may well be on their way to a higher hospital in the sky. Now, the staff participated actively in all these religious rites. Bart's was a separate case coming onto, because they weren't allowed chantry chapels till quite late, because the priory next door was worried about losing money. So they weren't even allowed an image of St Bartholomew in the hospital itself, just in case the St Bartholomew's priory next door lost some money. So there were, as now, competing interests for the local finances to support these institutions. And again, abroad, this magnificent building here, which is the interior of the medieval hospital in France. You can see two bays on either side, with the curtains to curtain off the beds. Maybe more than one occupant per bed quite often, but not necessarily naked adjacent to each other. These were quite large beds for beds in their period, and they could well have had separate sheeting for the top to separate them. So it may be not quite as bad as it seems, and certainly I was impressed by the size of the medieval wooden framework into which two people went into. If you consider 14 people shared the great bed of Ware, which you can see in the Victorian Albert, it's not much bigger than some of these hospital beds. Well, allegedly shared on one night. Now, the general public also attended this worship, and for example, St Bartholomew's, as well as being a hospital, was the local parish church. This is from the Barts Museum, and if you're interested in this subject, do go and have a look. It's small but beautiful and really, really well presented, showing the nun here. She could either be giving the dole, which is dole here, the bread and the beer, or she could be attending one of the sick inmates. And they looked after these people till they were well. There was limited medical care, because it was expensive, really. One of the sisters at York was a medica, and John Murfield, he was a cleric at Barts, wrote the Breviarium Bartholomew in 1380. John of Ardern, which shows you why they didn't have surgeons, he said in his book, "Beware of scarce askings, for our scarce askings setteth not both the market and the thing." So if you don't charge a patient enough, you're going to undermine the market, and they're not going to get better. And that is perhaps something else that might be introduced from the medieval period, is to realise that medical care is expensive, and it always has been. If we perceive something as free, we don't value it. So people don't turn up to outpatient clinics. We have medicines that only 50% of people take. Some of these medicines cost £100 a week to provide. So we may actually want to be looking at how we use our resources nowadays. And certainly this happened in the Tudor period, and we'll talk about that. Look at the fee that some of them had. The King's physician was retained at a fee of 100 marks. And a surgeon on the Irish exhibition put in a bill for £66, 13 shillings and sixpence. This could have actually built a small hospital in those days. And that was just his bill for going to Ireland. Perhaps he didn't like the weather. But that was just for his medicine and travelling expenses. His wages were on top, and so his other expenses. And Elsingspittle, 37 shillings and twopence due to Robert the Leech, and 10 shillings to Geoffrey the Barber. So although they didn't employ staff, there were mechanisms of having doctors provided, and some people bequeathed in their wills, as was mentioned briefly, the fact that doctors had to attend. So they were rather like the consultants in the early NHS in 1948. They had their private practices outside, but they were then paid a salary to attend the hospital. And that's why when you went into hospitals when you were younger, your consultant only came in on certain days, on what was called the old contract. And that's the reason why he was part-time and was contracted into the NHS part-time. The hospital was run by the senior nurses and the staff doctors, the housemen, which is why they were called housemen. And we worked 120 hours a week as housemen when I was at Barts. We lived in that hospital, we breathed in that hospital. We felt like we'd almost died in that hospital by the time we left it. And then we promoted to becoming other house doctors, junior registrars, and on to the exalted senior registrar, who was able to go home at 7 o'clock at night, but he would always be called in if there was an operation. So this system actually was already in existence in the medieval period, and we think of it as a modern system. And this is where we differ now, is because one of the other big functions of medieval hospital was education. Initially started possibly by accident because many pregnant women died, and then the hospital was left with a problem, a baby. And they had a duty to look after this baby till it was fit enough to go out into the world. And so one of the things they did was to educate. And in fact, later on, they became such good at educating that it became a little profitable byline. And many hospitals stopped seeing sick people at all and just became educational institutions. some educational institutions became attached to hospitals. So St Anthony's Hospital, a famous medieval hospital in London, eventually becomes attached to Eton College, and here's the medieval schoolroom at Eton College, still pretty much intact as it would have been when those boys were in there in the Tudor period. And I imagine that a medieval hospital that was set up to look after children and to educate them would have looked like this. There were documented fights between the boys at these hospitals because, for reasons I will come on to later, the boys at St Anthony's were called Tantony pigs, and they didn't like being called pigs by the boys from up the road at St Paul's, and robust fights used to occur. There were other hospitals as well, St Bart's and St Catherine's. St Anthony's, of course, educated Sir Thomas More and John Whitgift. John Whitgift himself was to go on and found a medieval hospital during the exact period we're talking about in Croydon. Some remains of this still remain, and also become an archbishop. So these poor boys in these early grammar schools were being elevated. This was social engineering in action. The last time we saw this was in the grammar schools in England in the 1920s, 30s, 40s and 50s. And we've actually seen a retrograde in social movement since the abolition of the grammar schools. Now, whether you're pro-grammar school or anti-grammar school for educational reasons, it doesn't affect this argument. Grammar schools were a conduit for a few lucky people to escape and move through the social orders, and there's no question that that was true. Now, transient hospitals, there are records all over. I was at a tube station in the West End of London. I can't remember why I was there. Anyway, there's a little leper hospital that was there. It doesn't exist, there's nothing there, but there's a little plaque saying this was once a leper. Ravenscourt Park is where it was, just outside Hammersmith. And then in these records there was Spittal House in Tottenham. But before the Black Death, as I mentioned, just the one next to St Paul's there in the red, smack in the city, St Thomas Acon, which is now the Mercer's Hall. Now, pre-Reformation health reform, so before the Reformation there was health reform. The first independent freestanding organisations we mentioned occurred just after the conquest. London was well provided, so were many other towns, York, Bristol, Norwich, Exeter and Canterbury. Some of these become extinct, and there's three reasons they might become extinct. They could have run out of money, that's because they were poorly endowed, or the endowment itself failed due to a foreign war or some other reason. They could have run out of patients, so the specific cause no longer was there, so Jewish converts. If you made a hospital for Jewish converts, you soon run out of Jewish converts after one or other pogrom that was going on. And if you had a hospital for leprosy and there's no more lepers 150 years later, you run out of patients for it. So you have to do two things. St Nicholas Hambledown converts to be an almshouse. Some of the other hospitals convert to be schools, and some of the other hospitals are just left to fall down and rot, apart from the one in Stourhead, because there's a large market next to it, which is, funnily enough, where Newton bought his prisms to do his original prism experiments, which is just outside a leper hospital. And then some were suppressed, and Henry VIII wasn't the only person suppressing hospitals, and nor will Andrew Lansdowne be the last. Henry V, the Alien Priory Act, closed several hospitals, some of them in London. Henry VIII, of course, the closure of the monasteries, anything then associated with the monastery, including the internal hospitals for the monks and the external hospitals for the lay who came to stay, were closed. Very few exceptions to that rule, but there were some. And then Edward VI suppressed the fraternities, which closed down the last remainder. This is the interior of the living quarters of the hospital at Winchester. Look at the magnificence of how this building was put in. We're now looking across to the large Romanesque church across the square. As a visitor, you wouldn't even get into here. You'd never see this. You were housed outside in the outer cloister, where you'd be put into large dormitories, single-sex dormitories, probably 100 or so people staying on their way to Winchester. Now, the service itself, you might think, was a bit of a nuisance to them, so I interviewed the current head warden of this hospital, and I said, do you still find it a nuisance having to say medieval prayers every single day for Stephen of Bly? He said, it's not. He said, we have got it down to a fine art. I think 7 minutes is now our record. And I'm quite sure that in the medieval period there would have been many examples of this, and in fact there are examples in the records of people complaining that the religious duties were being perfunctory and committed to superficially. What I'd like to do now is just to briefly run through, I'm not going to do this in any length, and if you are interested in this, you can archive a lecture on this, just to run through the major London institutions and the politics of what happened to them and what was going on. Here we have, of course, the most famous and the best hospital in the world, St Bartholomew's, and you can see in Wingart's painting, that it's outside the walls. The larger building is the Priory, and of course this is much larger than what remains today, because as you walk into the Priory, as you walk in through the black and white Tudor gateway, if you look on the floor on either side, you'll see the marks on the floor which were the main piers of the nave, and then you begin to understand how impressive this building was. The bit that's left to us was the tiny bit, that's the transepts and the little bit behind the altar, and very impressive it is too. It's the little building down here, further down, just outside the city walls again, that is St Bart's Church, and here it is today. Now, this was rebuilt in the 1400s and then re-endowed, again Richard Whittington. Then it was damaged and there's a 17th century annex attached to it. This hospital was able to maintain its work because of rich endowments, and this photograph was in the archives at Bart's, and I came out looking like a coal miner when I left that place. And here is a photograph of one of the medieval houses that was an original endowment to that hospital, which was kept in the records there. Anyway, there are a number of issues that happened, but one of the important things that I'd like to mention is that this hospital also acted as a place of stay over. It was also important for looking after women who were pregnant and looking after their children after death, if they were unfortunate enough to die during childbirth, as many women were in those days. So it eventually becomes a guest house, an orphanage, a school. So this famous hospital, which you can see just before its reconstruction by James Gibb as one of the first of the Italianate-style buildings in this country. The other ones would have been Burlington House. You can't see much of that now, but if you go into the coffee room downstairs, you can see James Gibbs' work there. And Newgate Prison, which sadly is no longer with us due to prison reform. The child would be cared for until weaned, and then full expense. They also rescued babies from Newgate Prison in the medieval period and looked after them. How it was funded? Well, by endowments. And in 1260, the widow of Walter de Shaw gives the hospital his houses in Smithfield to finance the education of 2 of her sons. So education is now becoming a better way to make money than looking after the poor. And then the dissolution. Gresham petitions for this to be saved, and Sir John Ayliffe is the personal surgeon to Henry VIII, and we know that personal surgeons are very valued by how much they were paid by their kings. He also happens to be a colleague and a friend of the other major surgeons of the period who were also working at Bart's, who were able to try and influence the king. Now, they were able to influence on behalf of Bart's, they failed on behalf of St Anthony's and several other hospitals, and these were closed immediately. Now, one of the interesting things about this hospital is the bit on the bottom right is that first hospital I showed you in Canterbury. The bit on the top right is the bottom part of the tower which was reconstructed, but they didn't reconstruct this bit here, and you can see it's an identical type of architecture. This is actually Romanesque architecture built in the base of this medieval tower that was built upon it, and surely we are looking at the remains of the original church built in 1123, and it would be in keeping both with the materials and with the style and design. But that's the only bit that's left. The front hall here, rebuilt in 1702 with a statue of Henry VIII, the great refounder of this hospital. Although he destroyed a medieval institution, he refounded it and made it a hospital, not an orphanage, not a place for wayfarers, but a hospital that was starting to be recognised as what we'd recognise hospitals to be today. So there is a clear transition in this Tudor period, and it is political. And he also endows it. He says, I'll give you £500 as long as you guys in the city provide the other £500. I'm not paying for it all. You've got to pay for some of it. This makes it valuable to people in the city. And this hospital survives many periods, survives the Blitz when doctors and nurses were killed in that hospital on the dreadful night when St Paul's was nearly scorched and they burnt to death. This hospital was loved by the local population. And that's one of the reasons that it survived. And this is why these hospitals are very different from a modern hospital that's founded. Very rarely are modern hospitals loved with a passion in the way that these ancient institutions are. And you cannot just close this down and move it to Hackney and say everything is going to be fine, because this is rather like closing down several colleges in Oxford and moving them to Hackney. It just isn't quite the same thing. Now, Money, public subscription. Despite this good endowment that's coming in, Dr. Radcliffe himself gives £500 a year for the improvement of the general diet in the hospital and £100 a year to buy linen. Cleanliness and food and clean water are going to be a recurrent theme. St Thomas's, of course, we can immediately ignore because they say they're the oldest hospital in London. Of course, they're not. There was a small hospital founded. Oh, the monastery was quite an interesting story. This was founded by the pious virgin of a miserly ferryman. And he was so miserly that when he thought that he would try and get some more money, so when he died, he had himself tied up in a sack, but he wasn't dead. He was just pretending to be dead. So he had all his friends round for drinks, and they were going to give money to him. Then he was going to uncut himself in the sack and come out and have some more money. But then they saw the corpse moving. They thought, my God, it's alive. So they went up and they beat it with sticks until he really was stone dead. So he unfortunately died a little unfortunately. But his daughter was very holy. And of course, now being a rich woman, was pursued. And she didn't want to get married. So she founded the monastery, which had this hospital attached to it. It's a useful place to attach a hospital because it's on the main route to the south of England, and subsequently, within 100 years, this is going to be the site of pilgrimage to Thomas à Becket's tomb, which, following the difficulties of getting to Santiago de Compostela, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, and also to Jerusalem, and we'll talk about that very briefly, it turns out that Canterbury is one of the least dangerous places to go to, although you do have to go past Harbledown, which is where the lepers would come out with their clappers and the shoe, and it was rather like the crusties in Bristol. It was, you'll give us a donation or we'll scratch on you, or something like this, and so people scared of this disease, of course, gave the donation so that the lepers would stay away. And there were several Erasmus's mentions of him being harassed by these people. Now, this burnt down. Behold at Southwark, the ancient spital, built of old to entertain the poor, entirely reduced to ashes. It's refounded by the Bishop of Winchester, interestingly, on the other side of the street. So here we can see what is now Southwark Cathedral, which is the original site. It's then refounded further down where the other church is here, the Church of St Thomas, and the buildings around the back of this building are the site of the old St Thomas's Hospital, where it stayed for a long, long time until they built the railway there, and little bits of the old operating room, I'm sure that you know, are still there and can still be visited as a fascinating museum. What's interesting about these operating theatres, remember, is they didn't operate every day. They didn't operate very much at all, even in the Victorian periods. The records at Barts show they'd probably do 4 operations a week, and each surgeon would come in and do his operation in the theatre as a theatre. Sister once complained to Abneath, he said, your coat is filthy, because they took off their normal clothes to put on their operating coats, which were covered with blood and pus and so on. And as they put on this filthy, ancient frock coat, which was, even by those days, out of fashion, Sister complained. He said, Sister, my dear, he said, it will last a good while longer. And then proceeded with the operation. His record for a hind quarter amputation, that would probably take about 1 hour and 20 minutes today, was 40 seconds. He did actually take off the 4 fingers of the medical student holding the leg and the left testicle of the patient. But nevertheless, the patient survived. Now, if you go through the mortality rates at Barts, and this is something you only do if you're bored, and I have done this, you can see that there are decades of change. The mortality rates fall decade on decade on decade. And this was all supposed to be due to Lister and the clean spray and hygiene. It's got nothing to do with that because the spray hadn't been invented. And in fact, it was so awful that when it was invented, only the Germans could operate under it. And even then they wrote pamphlets saying, fort mit dem spray, because it is horrible working when your eyes are covered in carbolic and so on, they're watering and you're dripping tears and sweat and carbolic into the wound. So antisepsis was not the answer. Really, the answer came later, and it was asepsis. And the pictures in the 1890s of the Barts operating theatre with the instruments in carbolic, vulcanization of rubber had just arrived, allowing the surgeons to be distant from the wound, separated by rubber, made big differences. But the big difference in mortality was, we've heard it, diet. And what happened in the 1780s was they used to purge you with mercury. They used to starve you. They used to bleed you of 2 to 4 pints of blood before, just to prepare you for your operation. Then you went in and had your operation, such as your hind quarter amputation or whatever it was they were going to do to you, removal of the breast or a tumour, and you had a high mortality rate. By the 1840s, it was considered this wasn't a good idea, and Smithfield was donating meat to the patients at Barts, and so they were given steak and steak pies, or if they couldn't consume them, soups, high-protein soups. They were also given beer, good quality beer, porter, London porter, which had oysters in it, again high protein. So decade on decade, as these improvements in nursing and medicine and care were occurring, medicine actually was an improvement in medicine. The surgeons were just as good in the medieval period as they were then. They hadn't really learnt an awful lot, a little bit of cautery, but the Arabs knew about cautery. Circulation of the blood, the Arabs knew about the circulation of the blood. It doesn't help you actually stop a patient bleeding to death when you've snipped something and it's gushing out at you. I can tell you that's a fairly frightening event. You've got to think on your feet, and I have to think on my feet exactly the same as a medieval surgeon had to as well. What stopped them dying was the diet. Now, Whittington donates to this a chamber with 8 beds for young women who have done amiss, and all things that are to happen in that chamber are to remain a secret. So yet again we're having this story of looking after. Remember, sex was not invented in 1966, despite what the Beatles and various other people thought. It was actually going on in the medieval period, and how to care for this and to allow those women, if they survive, to go back and take a place in society without anything being known was extraordinary. So it wasn't only if the mother died that the baby was kept, even if the mother survived, the baby could be kept, so that if it was an illegitimate baby, so she wouldn't be shamed and could then go on and have a happy marriage. Now, St Thomas I mentioned before, and this is why St Thomas's Hospital is called St Thomas. The reason I'm going to briefly divert here is this is the first documented cure of blindness that we have in the record, apart from Jesus' miracles. The story concerns Aylward of Westinglong and his neighbour Fulk, who were working in the field, and they had an argument because Fulk owed Aylward some money for some land he had lent. Fulk decides that this wasn't the case, and the records say that they go off to the local pub to discuss it, as is the English fashion. Whilst they're in the pub, they say, look, I'll let you off half the bill if you pay for the beer. They get rolling drunk. He decides he's not going to pay Aylward the money, so Aylward in a temper runs off, goes round to his house, steals a pair of ditching gloves, and then goes back to his house. Unfortunately for him, Fulk's children are in the garden and see it, and run to the pub and say, Dad, 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 you know your mate? Well, he's just nicked the ditching gloves. Let's go and get him. So they go round, and they beat him up, and they take him round, and they call in the magistrate, who says, well, it's a pair of ditching gloves. Now, come on, you're both a bit drunk, calm down. But the kids then run round and put some other things round, like a whetstone and some knives. Say, oh, it's not just the ditching gloves, Your Honour. Look at that, he's got the knives, he's got the whetstone, he's a real guilty one, this one. So, right, so then he has to be arraigned. So now there is enough to arrest him, and he's arrested and put in jail. Now, very unfortunate for him, there'd been law reform. And the law reform was the Assizes of Clarendon, when Henry II had decided to bring in the newfangled European Directive of Human Rights, which in those days was trial by ordeal. So sacrificing the age-old English traditions of decency, honesty and good law, we have this European system. So he's then tried by this. He has to put his hand into the water to seize the red-hot metal. He's burned and scalded. It's bound in the church in the natural way, and 3 days later it is unbound. It's found to have festered. He's therefore guilty and suffers the punishment. The punishment is depicted in the Trinity window here. I've enlarged it for you, and it shows him having his eyes being gouged out and his testicles and member being cut off in front of his eyes before his eyes are gouged out. And here's the magistrate with his white cap overlooking this to make sure it's done properly. He staggers off. He now realises his life is over, and he prays. And he prays at the altar of the Virgin Mary, who comes to him and says, if you pray to St Thomas, he will come to you and he will help you. So he prays, and interestingly, and this is the only one of St Thomas's miracles where St Thomas actually appears, because St Thomas actually was a blood cult. And what that was, if you wanted to be cured by St Thomas, and many people were, after he was killed, he had the back of his head cut off, his brains and blood were all, it was a mess. It really was like a Inspector Morse mystery. And they cleaned it all up and they put it into pots and stored it for some years. And if you came to the shrine, you were given some of this blood on your tongue, or as a topical treatment for your sores. Now, there are several problems with that. One is it's disgusting. Secondly, it's vaguely heretical, because Jesus, of course, had blood. And then thirdly, there's the problem with raw supplies. And they're going to run out, because there is only one brain and 8 pints of blood at most, and you can probably scrape up 2. So what they did, they hit on the happy solution of dilution. So they diluted this in wine, and this lasted until Henry VIII destroyed the last remaining stocks. So if you do want a cure for anything and you want St Thomas's blood, you have to now go abroad and have other saints where their bloods are used in a similar fashion. Back to this guy. So he appears in life. And St Thomas comes in with his crozier and touches him on his eyes and on his members, and here we see him running down the street, pointing to his eyes. You can now see he's giving money to the poor, and he has this enormous erection, which is this tree that's discreetly shown growing out from between his legs as this palm tree. So St Thomas was a very, very powerful person, and that's why the hospital was named after him. And that, as by the way, is the first cure of blindness that we have documented. Now, St Mary's in Archbishop Gate has been mentioned before. You've seen the plan of it, and here's a drawing of it. This is enormous. We think Liverpool Street Station is enormous, and what's interesting about Liverpool Street Station is that it does have these early, the Victorian copies of the early English lancet windows, and that's the size of it. So you're looking at a building that is not much smaller than Liverpool Street Station itself. Very, very interesting hospital and well worth looking into. And we're finding out all sorts of interesting stuff here, possibly that syphilis was a pre-Columbian disease. It may well be that medieval monks had syphilis, and I'm hoping that Carl Rawcliffe will talk about this when she talks about leprosy, because she happens to be one of the experts in this field. In 1843 it was suppressed, but by the time it was suppressed it was in a bad way. It had 180 beds, it only had a revenue of £504, but however the work that had been done was important, and again the local people petitioned with Gresham to the king, but he was having none of it, and it was refused and granted to Richard Morrison. This is an interesting hospital. This is a blind hospital. Much of it remains here. 1331, founded by William Ayliffe, another mercer, on his own land. The remains of the church was rebuilt in Fulton, USA, and there's bits of it over there. But this enormous size of it here, this is only a little bit of a little bit that was remained. After the dissolution it was knocked down, but a small part of it was kept as the local parish church. You're looking at it here. This is the German redecoration of this in early 1940s, but it's still a substantial building. And I think I'd like to reiterate what Professor Rawcliffe told you earlier. These were substantial, important buildings. Very expensive, very well endowed. Now it gets into debt, and in 1541 it burns down on Christmas Eve, and on that site Sion College was built. Now, this was dedicated to blind priests, and we looked after blind people. Because everyone's saying France, how good it was, how wonderful it was to have this. Look at Italy. Not necessarily so. This is the blind hospital at the top that's in Paris, the Quinze-Vingts. There, the inmates are made to put on dunces hats and go out and play and to be mocked at by the local population and thrown crusts of bread. Our blind are looked after in institutions like this. So I'm afraid we've had all the one-up for the French and the Italians. Well, it's one-up for the Old English. They didn't do too badly when they did it properly. And there are other instances of specialist hospitals for blind people as well around this period. Domus Conversiorum, as we know, just where the House of Rolls was, this is Matthew Paris's little sketch in his own book, contemporaneous what the building would have looked like. Built for Jews who had converted. You had a choice. You could leave, if you were lucky, take some of your money with you, you could be killed, or you could convert. And amazingly, a lot of people converted. They had special uniforms. It's sort of got echoes a little bit of the Star of David, and this is an uncomfortable story to talk about post-20th century. But remember, all hospitals had special robes. But these robes had a mark that marked them as Jewish converts, which meant that they couldn't go out and do usury and exchange money and a lot of their businesses. Of course, they eventually die out, and then you can have in Jews who were Jews abroad and come in to stay there. But by 1344, there's only 8 left, and then 1371, only 2 left. So we can see the gradual extinction of a rather large, well-endowed, expensive medieval hospital that eventually is converted into the new house for the Master of the Rolls. The Savoy we've mentioned before. Look how magnificent a building it was. Look how magnificent a building it still is. And here are still extant remains of this hospital. One of the wards leading onto the site, one of the ward chapels that we mentioned before. A very interesting design, unique in England and based on the Italian design. Well endowed. They were well looked after. But you could only stay one night. You had to leave. Unless you were sick. And then the sick were looked after. So good food, fresh clothes. You got fresh clothes, and only when you left were you given back your old clothes, which had been deloused in the ovens, Professor Rawcliffe mentioned. And if they were threadbare and no good, you were given new clothes to go out with. So you were well looked after. This building breaks my heart, because I was in St Catherine's Dock this weekend, which was built on the site of this beautiful hospital that was famous for its medieval interior with gargoyles and beautiful carvings, and unfortunately destroyed in the 1840s to make way. It was a female foundation, which is interesting, but it had male and female inmates to look after. Eventually it gave up general nursing to become a school and as an almshouse for 18 beadswomen. Becomes very famous for its polyphonic singing. And survives the Reformation, of course, because it's not a church foundation. So this one survives. The church foundations do not. Thomas of Acon is another great loss architecturally, as we can see from this building, this statue of Christos recumbent, which is the only remains of this hospital. If we want to know what it would have looked like, this is the Bedestan in Cyprus, and this is what this church would have looked like. It's built by the same architects, by the same people. Now, St Thomas Acon was a military order founded on the walls of Acre when, in 1191, and it was meant to look after the sick and injured knights and the wounded, and it also had another role, which was to ransom the captured. By 1360 it had abolished its military role and the rule of the Teutonic Knights, became an Augustan foundation and carried on working, but unfortunately it was surrendered in 1538, in one of the minor suppressions, before we go on to the major suppressions. But Gresham again petitions. Gresham, he's all over the place. He stamps his way all over here. And what a good and great man, as many of these influential citizens of London were. Whittington, we're going to come on to him later, Milburn. But Gresham was the granddaddy and the greatest of all of these in some ways, in that there's so many social causes he is at the back of, daring to petition a semi-lunatic, syphilitic king who was already known to have been involved with the killing of 3 of his wives, or was about to be involved with it, who's an extraordinarily dangerous man to deal with. So very brave as well. Interesting about this building, St Thomas again, this is a direct relation to the famous St Thomas we were talking about before, because this was his brother-in-law's house, and it was founded in his brother-in-law's house. And his father was a mercer, and this is now the site of the Mercer's Hall. St Mary's Bethlem we know now as Bedlam. It has a checkered history, but essentially it was one of the first institutions that became specialised for dealing with the insane early on. The only image we have of it is the famous copperplate map here, which shows it opposite St Botolph's. So it's a little bit further down the road from the large St Mary's Hospital, which we spoke about earlier. It is rescued by the Lord Mayor, and Henry VIII is one of the 4 hospitals that Henry VIII re-endows after the Reformation in London, for specific reasons. So you have Bridewell for the elderly and infirm, you have this for the insane, you have St Bartholomew's for the sick, and you have Christ's for the children and education. And those are the 4 hospitals that were refounded or founded at that period. And St Thomas's on the other side of the river, so it's not really a London hospital, was refounded there, and now it's a Westminster hospital, of course, because it's opposite the Houses of Parliament, which again gives Barts an upper hand, because Barts, of course, is still on its original site, which is why it is the most important hospital, and it's a very important one that we keep. Anyway, there's a number of things. We know about the chainings, we know about all the horrible things that happened in Bedlam. There was a lot of instances of stealing from the endowments, beds being sold. One stage, all the patients had all the beds sold, so that the guy could have 40 shillings to pay off his debts. There was another one where someone kept his mistress in the hospital for a while. So these medieval hospitals, although essentially set up to do good things, there were several examples where they were not doing good things. Other alien houses, these are alien houses because they're set up with alien endowments, not necessarily English endowments. These pilgrimage hospitals that if you go down to Santiago to Compostela, you will realise is a very dangerous place to go. We know it's a dangerous place because even Charlemagne was defeated there by these people. These barbaric bearded people took the whole of the back half of Charlemagne's army and put them to the sword, Roland's famous horn. When he was ignored, Charlemagne left him to his death because he was too scared to go back and take them on. Now, on your way down to Santiago de Compostela, you've got to go through this place. They're called Basques. They're really scary. They even scare the Spanish to this day. And you need several military orders to protect your hospital and your pilgrims. And so they set them up. The one we're interested in is the third one, the Canon Regulars of St Mary Roncesvalles, founded in 1132. And then they have an endowment and a hospital founded in London by Charing Cross. And this is Northumberland House, which was built on their site. Now, Money was raised by pardoners, and this is mentioned in Chaucer, of course. With him there rode a gentle pardoner of Rouncival, his friend and his compeer, and there he is, collecting money for this hospital by a variety of semi-fraudulent means, but they were still getting the money in. Many stories here that you can read about on the website or have the podcast from a previous lecture, but it's also got an audit, this hospital, which is really good. So it tells you the patients come in, they spend 3 or 4 days in the almshouse, and then next to them it says, died. And you go down the next one, spends 2 days in the almshouse, died. So there was obviously a high mortality in these people travelling or the sick. Some of these were deserving poor. You know, it's rather like Spike Milligan on his gravestone. You know, he says, I told them I was sick. And this is what these people were doing. And they were saying we're sick. But this was famous for its food. And in fact, the Rouncival pea that was grown in the gardens here that went down to the River Thames stayed in existence until the late 1800s when it was grown in Massachusetts. And it was a very useful pea because you could use it both as a soup pea for protein, but you could also use it in its younger phase, a garden pea, for vitamins. So it was both types of pea. The Old English peas were stew peas, peas porridge, yellow, lentils, hard, had to be stewed, really just stodge and a bit of protein. You didn't eat them as we imagine peas to be today, unless you're from the south of France. This was one that was suppressed by Henry V, not Henry VIII, and the Alien Foundations. St John of Jerusalem, beautiful. This was the one that had the enamelled roof, an extraordinary place, but it was a bit private, and really you had to be a friend of these guys to get in there. And here's the picture of it, where it glittered in the sun. Now, we can't see very much of this today. We can see the gatehouse, and you can actually see the church itself. If you go there to the right, it's in underground. You can see much of the medieval church crypt, which is still in existence. They wore the white cross on the black, until they went to war, when they wore the white cross on the red. Now, they were unpopular and they were hated by the local people. This was a private foreign enterprise that was disliked. They took a lot of money from people. They owned a lot of land in England. And in fact, during one of the peasant revolts, they actually attacked the abbot, killed him, and played football with his head, allegedly. It was totally destroyed. It was then rebuilt. And then it survives for a while, this great big hospital building. It's then destroyed after the Reformation and becomes, Proctor Somerset takes it over, blows it up with dynamite, this beautiful building, and uses it as hardcore for Somerset House next to King's College, where you can't see any of its remains today. But if you want to know why Somerset House is called Somerset House, it's actually that medieval hospital they did. And also the Prior of Kilburn, where the nuns were expelled, becomes St John's Wood, because it was owned by St John's Hospital. And this is another example of the monies that were owed. You'll see here in the Thomas Acomb picture here, this house here in the Midlands, this was owned by the hospital in London, and the money and rents from this place would go to London. And in Rouncival's case, on to France. And if you're having a war with France, as Henry V was, this is really not good enough, so you're going to have to suppress these. St Anthony's was also an alien house, again with the Tau. Any pig that was too sick to be bothered killing in Smithfield Market had to have a bell put round it and set off free in the City of London, where it was your Christian duty to feed. And some of these, and they used to follow you around, they used to come into your house. There was a saying, he follows me like a Tanzany pig. And they grew to enormous sizes, and then they could be killed, and they provided food for the inmates and brethren of St Anthony's Hospital, which was roughly about where the Royal Mint is now. It's just on the other side of the road, and there's a little plaque there. St Anthony was quite an important saint, because he could do things like St Anthony's Fire and a couple of other things. 1414 could have been suppressed, didn't. It only had 12 infirm old men in it at that time. Did survive a bit later and becomes a school, then becomes the Huguenot chapel, and then is destroyed to make way for money. And you see here, this is the site of the 13th century hospital of St Anthony's, demolished in 1840. Leprosy I'm not going to talk about, because that's going to be spoken about in a separate lecture later in this season. I said to point out that some buildings, this is the gatehouse of the Leprosy Hospital. This is the rebuilt version, but we know the original one was a fairly impressive building as well, from what we can see in Vingart's drawing of London. So St James's Hospital, which St James's Palace was formerly St James's Hospital for leprous sisters. These sites are scattered all over. St Giles is another one. St Giles was actually famous. This was originally a leprosy hospital till they ran out of lepers. And then it became a place where it was the last place you had a drink on your way to Tyburn, because just further down that road there is Oxford Circus, and on the way to your last place on earth. A parting cup or a bowl of ale as an act of charity. And it continues. Even when it's a parish church, you could still go there. 1402, there's still 9 lepers. 1535, at the Suppression, and 14 paupers. Well, it's not been founded, so the original endowments, it's become a fraudulent thing if you're Henry VIII and you want to get hold of the cash, so he closes it down. Many transient houses, many would have been just small rooms or a couple of rooms, such as this, which is a priest's house, where we know that priests stayed, 7 priests lived in this building. And a lot of these little houses would have looked like this. They're not really in the record very much. They come and they go. And St Augustine's Pappy is probably one of the biggest of these. And this is suppressed not by Henry VIII, but by his son, Edward VI, in the suppression of the fraternities. Whittington we've mentioned before, and this still survives, but not in its original form. It's now moved out into the suburbs and still exists as Whittington's almshouses. And similarly, Milbourne's almshouses. This is what almshouses look like in the medieval period. This is Ulm, and this is the corridor that takes you to each of the individual rooms where the patients, the inmates, the clients would live. Again, they have to rise and say prayers, and there's sort of little muttering about this. So house reform is constantly required. 1348, these hospitals decline. We lose several things then. We lose lepers, because a lot of lepers died in this. We also lose doctors. The Lollards come up, and they suggest abolishment of all the chantries. Now, a lot of these hospitals depended on chantries for their money. St Bart's, by the late 1300s, had got permission to have chantries in it, and chantry chapels were paying the bills for the food. So if you abolish the chantry chapels, you're going to run out of money very, very quickly. There were less endowments, and more endowments now are going to form almshouses, as we've seen. Less are going to be forming these rather larger institutions or specialist hospitals. And by 1414, they say these medieval hospitals, for the most part, now decayed. And they were accused of diverting hospital income to other uses. And one example of this would be St Mark's in Bristol, where the money originally founded to feed 100 poor people a day with a single chaplain becomes a house of Austinian canons feeding only 27 poor. So there's now rather more clergy than there are patients. How reminiscent today, where there are now more administrators than there are doctors and patients, which is becoming an interesting situation. Some of these have become sinecures. So they were just actually used just for the money, which was debated against. And they would think, well, we can't tell the difference between sturdy beggars who are faking illness and the deserving poor. There are many ways to justify embezzlement, even in those days, as there even are today, as the situation, unfortunately, with the elderly care homes that we've come across recently, which looks as if you sell off their houses and then you rent them back and then you retire with the cash. It's starting to look a little bit similar to some of these stories to me, and really does need to be looked at very carefully before we actually throw our current system into a system that mimics this private leaseback, because there are problems with that, as have been pointed out. Now, reform and dissolution. The London, they say, of Edward III was a city of palaces, and it was magnificent to look at, and foreigners coming to this town mentioned 2 things. One was how magnificent it was with all the churches, and by those churches, many of them, they meant the monasteries and the hospitals, and also the drunkenness of the population. But actually, they were well cared for, the poor people, but wages were falling. The corroborees we've done, there was shift of the work to the essentials. I love that, that's the clergy. So that's like saying, let's shift the income of the hospital to the administrators, and we're not going to use it to pay for the care of the sick and the infirm, which is what it was set up for. Very few of these older hospitals survive. They had to be refounded, the 2 large ones that we'd recognise today as St Thomas's and St Bart's. The ones that did survive were the almshouses, and this is the big picture of the almshouse at Ulm. And there's lamentations of the Christian against the City of London after the Reformation. Suddenly there were lots of poor people lying around on the streets. There was poverty, there was sickness. And we didn't need a Poor Act in England until the Elizabethan age, because the poor, it was our duty to look after them. It was our Christian duty to look after them. And to a large extent, this occurred. But that system itself had its stresses and strains, and there were examples that were seized upon of where it wasn't done properly. So the refounding we've mentioned, and here he is standing in his magnificence, Henry VIII at St Bart's Hospital. The museum is in there, where they've got facsimiles of the medieval bill, of the medieval documents, and also of the seals of St Bartholomew's. And also, if you want to buy the cartulary, it is on sale for a very, very small price at the moment, and it's a facsimile of a medieval cartulary if you're interested in taking this further. I have 2 copies, because I forgot I had one when I bought this, when I was reminded to buy the second one. Medicine we've dealt with. Most of this was outside the hospital. Somebody just mentioned briefly about why it was illogical. Well, not only was mercury good because this it was used for treatment because the rash of syphilis was fleeting, and Mercury is known to be the fastest planet. So Paracelsus would use mercury to treat a fleeting, transient illness that could have subsequent consequences, because they knew that syphilis was transient in its early stages, but they knew it led on to bad things later on. So Mars correlates with bravery and fortitude, and its correlation on Earth, the strong is iron ore, and it's red. So if you've got anemia, you haven't got enough Martian influence in you. You need something red. So anemic people get given iron. We've already identified that many people in this period were anemic. Anemia was a big problem, probably due to hookworm infestations. And they get chronic anemia from low-grade loss of blood. So there was a logic to this, and if the logic works, you then pursue it. And we do that to this day. We're not much different. We have a system of science and medicine that we work within, and it's got an internal logic to us that I can reassure you in 150 years' time will be considered completely barking mad. They say, did they really do that to these poor sick people? And they will, much as every 100 years we laugh at the doctors from 100 years before. And the specialist doctors then come in. This is John Freak, who's the first ophthalmologist in England, working in a hospital in a dedicated to look after ophthalmology patients. And as mentioned before, here's the dissection that's there. We know the names of these criminals who are hanging up on the side. There's Freak in his role at the Royal College of Surgeons. Ophthalmologists are surgeons, so we're called misters, as was alluded to by Tim earlier when he introduced. It's confusing for those of you from Scotland and other colonies. That's the 4 stages of cruelty. So let's have a little bit of a heated debate. I was sort of reading The Guardian the 14th of May, idly thinking whether my life would be better as a school teacher or as a doctor. And I saw in it that the local hospital I worked in, called Mayday, My Die, Probably Will Die, was voted the worst hospital in London. So I thought, now what would a medieval, the equivalent of The Guardian, say? So let's imagine the old Evening Standard of 1390. So it said, well, St Anthony's is voted best for grub, Bart's for nursing. St Cat's for kids, St Thomas the best for medicine, St Mary's Spital for cleanliness and latrines. We know that. We had diverted springs. Kings gave springs to divert fresh water to these hospitals. So they had good, clean latrines and fresh water to drink. We know that Bart's didn't have a spring, but it had fresh water from beer, and it was supplied beer. Inmates were given beer. We've mentioned that before. And also, architecturally, St Thomas Acon was possibly one of the most beautiful buildings in Europe. So here we go down. Medieval, cleanliness, water and bedding. Well, 3 stars to the medieval, I would say. Victorian, 1 star. There were issues there. Some of you might have heard of Florence Nightingale. The modern NHS, well, this is what I pointed out to the head of Médecins Sans Frontières when he said that our hospitals were medieval. I said, no. I said the modern NHS hospital resembles Scutari, not one of these wonderful places that I've been studying. Dignity to the poor and sick. That was their foundation. Dignity. I've shown that time and time again. Care, to be received with care and love, to look after them. Victorian, Florence Nightingale doesn't actually say until the later period, they were looked after very well, very perfunctory in a way, probably leading to the way the modern NHS was founded with that same system, we know better than you. Single-sex wards, medieval, absolute requirement. Victorian, absolute requirement. Modern NHS, they still haven't achieved this. How they unachieved it is a mystery to me, because when I was a houseman, I know, just as a man walking onto the female ward, I was accompanied by my sister and regarded very suspiciously. Never mind now where there's 6 bays with sort of half men, half women in various states of decrepitude, decay and mentality wandering around at different times of night. It's just awful. Why do we have to have a government directive that tells us we've got to have single-sex wards? It's so obvious. And there is no financial argument that can ever justify putting through people who are at their most vulnerable, either men nor women, through the indignities that we put them through in a modern NHS, which was not done in a medieval hospital. Rare example of Bethlem accepted, and that was done for special reasons and also due to corruption, not as a statute of how it's done. So, spiritual care of the sick and dying, fabulous. This was a wonderful place. If you wanted a hospital, and even today, St Anthony's Hospital down in Cheam, if you want a place to die, and remember, life is a sexually transmitted disease with 100% mortality. This is going to happen to all of us. Some of us don't know when it's going to happen, and they're all right. Some of us are told we have a malignant disease, and we know that our passing is going to be uncomfortable and terrible at the last. And thanks to Dame Cicely Saunders, it was transformed in England how we looked after. She taught us the medieval values of how to look after people who are going to die. And what you do there is you don't get the doctors involved, except for palliative care and pain relief. Why do coffins have nails in? To stop the body falling out, something like that? No, it's to stop the bloody oncologists getting in. So we spend somewhere like 70 to 80% of our total healthcare on the last year of life. And we've got to be careful about how we use resources. It may not be that treating cancer, it may be a matter of pride that we have worse cancer rates than anyone in the named world, outside, because it may not be an appropriate thing to treat. The prolongation of life is not the same as the dignity of life. And passing away people who are going to die, and passing them away in a comfortable way with their families around them in care and dignity, is probably the kindest thing that any doctor or nurse can ever do. And to do that so that the patient is not frightened and they're confident as they go forward into wherever they believe they're going to go, is probably some of the best medicine you can imagine. And there are so many documented evidence of this in the medieval literature. I can't remember whether it's one of Carol Rawcliffe's books or someone else's book I was reading, where they quote the Archbishop of Canterbury falls ill, he knows he's dying, he's nearby one of his houses. It is your book, isn't it? And they called it, he gets rid of all the doctors, the favourite one. He then says, we're not going to do any bloodletting, forget the urine. Your job now is to say goodbye to your family, write your will, say your prayers. And he passes peacefully in the night and he dies without having the equivalent of the oncologist in the coffin with him, torturing him for the last few minutes. Now, I'm not anti-oncologist necessarily, but I'm just saying that there is this temptation. Surgeons do things. You come to me sick, I'm going to cut it out. You come to me as your doctor, I'm going to give you a pill. And what we need to do is to sort of evaluate, yes, those things are all possibly good things, but not necessarily good things, and not necessarily good things without the empathy of care that goes with them. And sometimes we need to be confident enough that people are going to die. People are terrified in this country they're not going to have good deaths. This is why there are interest in assisted dying. People had good deaths in these hospitals. There are many documented instances in the medieval period. Food. Well, medieval hospitals, they were great on food. They were set up for food. They had their own gardens. It was fresh. If any of you are gourmets, I would advise you to come down and have a little lunch with me, if ever I'm allowed lunch, in my hospital, and then compare to what a medieval dinner might have been like in an average hospital. I think you'll have a bit of a surprise. Victorian hospitals, they were probably okay for food. It was a bit patchy, and the modern NHS, it's not my cup of tea, I think would be the politest way I could put it. Nursing care, medieval, excellent. Victorian, certainly, it was severe, but it was caring. You didn't have documented instances of water having to be prescribed so that elderly people didn't die of thirst, which was only last week. You didn't have examples of nurses walking around with clipboards, checking and ticking things. You had examples of nurses going round and nursing and doing the job properly. We as doctors learnt our trade from the senior nurses on the wards. It was her ward. We had to have her permission to walk onto the ward, even if there was an emergency when we were running in. As I remember on my first day being held back by my white coat and pulled back, saying, doctor, because you're a doctor until you do your FRCS and become a mister, just what do you think you're doing? Oh, there's a heart attack on. If you'd actually waited and asked my permission, you'd know it's not down this side of the ward, it's down that side of the ward, where you'll find Nurse so-and-so has everything prepared to help you, and the anaesthetist is on his way. Architecture. Well, medieval hospitals. We have one of the experts, the great hospital at Norwich. Many of the other examples I've shown you, just fragments remaining, show you how beautifully built, how well designed. Tall, good air, malaria, a very real thing. And this example of living in an environment like this does actually reduce cross-contamination. If 12 people live in a building that is 5 or 6 times the size of this, you are not necessarily going to be transmitting all the lurgies and so on that go around. And the modern NHS, well, there's an example. This is the latest rebuilding of Mayday Hospital, as quoted in The Guardian. And I just rest my case, whether you think medieval and Victorian, that could be a matter of taste. I don't think that could be a matter of taste. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Tudor Health Reform.